Right, my friends, you have done the massive fractional work on that beastly sympathetic nervous system video and then the decent sized parasympathetic. Now it's all downhill with the enteric nervous system, the gut brain, and nervous system entirely within the gut. This is how we'll test ourselves. 1 through 6 are descriptions of either the enteric or the submucosal plexus. Those two are the gut brain. They make up the gut brain. And then we'll do a little tracing on here and show a couple of sensory, integrate, respond loops that don't involve the central nervous system at all. Okay. Enteric nervous system, pretty straightforward, but do not underestimate its importance. It's a relatively simple topic to cover, and we'll be in and out of here in almost no time at all, but don't underestimate how important it is. This top line, there are as many neurons in the ENS as there are in the entire spinal cord, right? And then let's play a game. So somatic is on the left, right? Somatic on the left. Autonomic in the middle, we've killed those. And then enteric on the right. Can you get, so blue is sensory, right? Blue is sensory, green is motor. Can you get, let's go to the somatic nervous system all the way over on the left. Can you get from sensory to somatic without going through the CNS? Just follow the arrows. The answer is, of course, no, you cannot. The only route of sensory information is to the CNS and then out to motor and then to the effector. So you have to go through the CNS. Let's move to the autonomic in the middle. Can you get from sensory directly to motor without going through the CNS? And the answer, of course, just follow the arrows, is a no. You cannot do it. You have to go through the CNS. Now go over to the enteric on the right. Can you get from sensory to motor without going through the CNS? Yes, you can. You can come straight through and do the entire thing in the gut. Every box here is inside the stomach or inside the intestine or the colon or the esophagus in some cases, right? Can you go to the CNS? Yes. Where do you go from here? Well, you got to come over to the ANS and loop through there to get there, okay? So I'll show you both of those routes. Yes, you can do the whole thing in the gut. You can sense, integrate, and respond entirely in the wall of the GI tract. But you can sense and send to the CNS, then use an ANS. You know which one? You remember which one? Parasympathetic branch, CN, cranial nerve 10. You remember the vagus, cranial nerve 10? You can use that to run down to the motor and innervate all the smooth muscle and the cardiac muscle and the glands of the viscera. Okay? So that's a game you should be able to play and you should be able to enjoy. So ENS entirely, it's called the gut brain. Okay? What's the sensory side? You know what the sensory side is. We've done this. Interoceptors, stretch and chemistry. We're killing this. You guys know this. Stretch and chemistry. How much is the stomach wall stretching? How much is the intestinal wall stretching? What's the chemistry inside the lumen of the intestine or the stomach? Okay? Standard stretch and chemoreceptors, interoceptors, they're within the mucosal epithelium of the gut, of the GI tract, and they respond to changes in chemistry and they respond to stretch, right? You can send some sensory info via parasympathetic fibers of, again, which cranial nerve? Cranial nerve 10. You can run some slow parasympathetic sensory information to the CNS, right? Hey, I'm stretching out a little bit. Hey, there's some odd chemistry going on in my gut lumen, right? You can send those, okay? But you can also send that same sensory information directly to an interneuron, so not within the CNS, but directly within the gut wall, like a miniature brain inside the gut wall. And what does it look like? Let's put some pictures to words. Let's find out what it looks like. Because now we got to come here to look at the integration, okay? So first path, the one that we always know, you've got a receptor, call it some kind of receptor inside of this mucosa of the epithelium of the gut. This is the lumen of the gut. I'll put a big L right there. It's the center of the intestinal tract or something right there. So let's say you've got some kind of neuroreceptor, sensory receptor right in the gut wall, chemoreceptor, stretch receptor, whatever. And it comes out and it could either do one of two things, right? It could just simply run right up along these neural paths directly up to the CNS, right? This could be cranial nerve 10. Who knows? This could be a branch of the vagus nerve. And you're running some parasympathetic sensory information up to the CNS. Or if you wanted to, let's put another one here, you can bypass that, right? Where would this go? This would go up to possibly be received. This is the parasympathetic arm if it's kind of sensory, but it doesn't matter. It could go up and it could go to the hypothalamus, and it could trigger a sympathetic response, or it could trigger a parasympathetic response, and then it could return again on cranial nerve 10, some sort of post-ganglionic neuron. Okay, it could be from the mesenteric plexus. It could be from the inferior, the superior mesenteric. It could be from the celiac ganglion. Sorry, not plexus, ganglion. And it could come down. And if this is using the CNS, it'd come on down. And it would sort of ping on some motor neuron. And that motor neuron would get to work. And this would be the effector, right? Smooth muscle. And it would run down and it would trigger the smooth muscle of the intestinal wall here to contract. But you could shorten it up if you wanted to. You could have one here, and you could avoid the CNS by just simply running a sensory neuron to possibly somewhere around here, an interneuron right, let's say here, and then a motor neuron right here, again, innervating that same muscle cell and getting the smooth muscle of the gut wall, either the circular or the longitudinal. So either the muscle that goes around or it goes along the gut, either way. And you could do the whole thing on a loop entirely within the ENS. Okay. If you were to, either way, no matter how you kind of shake it out, you would sort of encounter two plexuses, right? The first plexus is the big one, and it's out in the muscular wall. It's between the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. It's called the myenteric. It's the bigger of the two. And because it sits in between the inner or the sort of deeper, or I guess, well, I'll skip superficial and deep because it's kind of relative to the gut or not. But let's say in between the circular layer and the longitudinal layer, you've got this myenteric plexus. And so since it sits in between those two smooth muscle layers, what is it really doing? It drives contraction of those two muscle layers, right? And that's found from the esophagus all the way down to the anus, the entire GIT or GI tract, except for the mouth, basically. So, and that's where you'll find it driving the musculature of the circular and the longitudinal smooth muscle around the gut. And those two together contracting, of course, are peristalsis, right? You're moving food bolus one way direction through the gut, downstream through the gut. The submucosal plexus is the one found inside the submucosal layer, inside of this gray layer. And you can see it sitting above. This is all the submucosal plexus. And that's the smaller of the two. And it sits right on top of all of these glands here. And inside of that mucosa, and shown, this one's shown free, but here's one shown inside the mucosa. These are the glands. And that submucosal plexus is sitting right there on those glands. And it can innervate those glands and get them to squeeze, right? And inject or secrete digestive enzymes into the gut lumen. And of course, this would be parasympathetic function, right? You want to get your digestion going and all those things. Okay? And that's found from the stomach to the anus. So a little bit lower than the esophagus, but no big deal. Okay? And this is all just loose areolar connective tissue in gray. That's the submucosa. And so the plexus inside the submucosa is the submucosal plexus. Makes sense to me, right? The plexus between the layers of the muscle is the myenteric. Remember muscle? It's not quite myo like we saw a million times in 40A, but MY, if a word starts with MY in anatomy, there's a good chance it's related to muscle. And of course, this plexus slips right in between the circular and the longitudinal muscle layers. So. Okay, and so yeah, I covered that, smooth muscle, and then secretion for the submucosal. And the two are connected. They can integrate with each other, okay? And in some, what can happen is the myenteric can drive the submucosal. So the submucosal can't drive the myenteric, but the myenteric, if it's triggered, can actually then trigger the submucosal to release glands. So the myenteric can act like the CNS, the mini CNS too, and it can drive the submucosal, right? Okay, what is the motor output? Well, we just already killed this, already covered that. The motor output of the myenteric is simply contracting the circular smooth and the longitudinal smooth muscles around the gut. And again, that's peristalsis, that wave-like contraction that moves food down the GI tract. And then what's the motor output? Remember, all autonomic nervous system and ENS nervous system output is going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. And in the case of the ENS, the enteric, since it's just the gut and the heart is not related, it's just simply smooth muscle, circular longitudinal, or the glands. Okay, and so that's the output. And the submucosal would be just triggering these glands here to secrete digestive enzymes, amylases, okay, proteinases, all sorts of digestive enzymes, bile, secreting that all into the gut lumen to aid with digestion. Right? And again, the myenteric is the leader of the two. It can drive the, so the myenteric out here can drive the submucosal and get the submucosal to work on the glands, but not the other way. The submucosal can't get the myenteric to stimulate. That's got to come on either an integrated sensory loop entirely within the gut wall, or remember the myenteric plexus can act entirely on autonomic and sympathetic and parasympathetic motor output too, right? So the myenteric plexus can be that intramural ganglion, if you want to, that is triggered by the traditional autonomic nervous system. I'm trying to just get you to understand those two routes, basically, those two ways that you can trigger the motor neurons, either the smooth muscle between the circular and the longitudinal, or the glands. So there's two ways to connect them. And the ENS can drive itself entirely, autonomously, where you just simply have the sense, integrate, and motor loop where it's all entirely done. And I'll just trace that right now. So here are the sensory neurons in mucosal epithelium. They're sensing stretch and they're sensing chemistry. So you could have a loop where you simply just loop sensory over to motor, and then you just simply had a motor effect, a secretion of the mucosal. That's one loop that doesn't involve the ANS at all. You could have a second where you came up to the myenteric plexus, synapse with an interneuron, and let the myenteric plexus drive. I'm just tracing these loops that are already here. Let the myenteric plexus drive the smooth muscle of the longitudinal circle. Or another loop where you came up to the myenteric plexus, then you another interneuron, but now you let the myenteric plexus drive mucosal secretion. All right, and those are all without any CNS input whatsoever. That's a special trait of the ENS. That's the uniqueness of the ENS, is you don't need CNS route. But you could certainly, along cranial nerve 10, you could certainly send some afferent slow sensory fibers right up to the CNS, right? Then from the CNS, either on a sympathetic route or a parasympathetic route, it doesn't matter. If it's sympathetic, those hypothalamic, the posterior hypothalamic nuclei. If it's sympathetic, could be pinging, remember, T1, the lateral gray horns of T1 through L3, the thoracolumbar output. And you could be sending a preganglionic neuron to the celiac ganglion, the superior inferior mesenteric ganglia, and that could be sending down, and that could be triggering the myenteric plexus. And the myenteric plexus could be the ganglion, right? This could be the ganglion that's being triggered by a preganglionic nerve. And then if this is the ganglion, then what's the postganglionic nerve? The postganglionic nerve could be this nerve right here, right? Triggering smooth muscle contraction, right? Or the postganglionic nerve could be this path right here, triggering mucosal secretion or glandular secretion, right? And remember, this would be an intramural ganglion. It would be inside of the wall of the actual organ, right? And that's that sort of look where you have intramural. And that could be parasympathetic too, right? So that could be cranial nerve 10 running all the way down to the myenteric plexus. And if the myenteric plexus were intramural, then you'd have that super long parasympathetic preganglionic neuron all the way from the cranial 10, output of cranial nerve 10, all the way to the wall, the intramural ganglion, and then a really short postganglionic neuron. So in parasympathetic, could be using this myenteric plexus as a ganglion. Okay, sympathetic would probably be using one of those previous ganglions I talked about, the mesenteric or the superior inferior mesenteric or the celiac, in which case it would be running a long motor neuron down to either the mucosal epithelium or the longitudinal. So this path here with the CNS coming from the CNS would be more on the parasympathetic arm to an intramural. I'll put IM. To an intramural ganglion right here. Okay? And if you're unsure about that pathway, go back and watch a little bit of the parasympathetic video to kind of pick up how this long preganglionic neuron off of cranial nerve 10 could come all the way down to a ganglion, an intramural ganglion in the gut wall to then trigger a really short postganglionic neuron, motor neuron, to the actual smooth muscle layer or to the epithelium. Anyway, that's enough of that. We kind of beat that to death, and let's just finish, right? So which is the larger of the two enteric plexuses? It is the myenteric, right? Which is the enteric plexus controlling secretion from the mucosal epithelium into the GIT, or the gastrointestinal tract. That's the submucosal. This enteric plexus, it is the one that can be controlled by the other, but it can't control. So the submucosal can be controlled by the myenteric, but it cannot control the myenteric. Right? The enteric plexus controlling smooth muscle contraction, either the circular or the longitudinal muscularis. That is the myenteric. The enteric plexus found within the loose areole or connective tissue of the submucosal. Well, inside the submucosal, we would expect to find the submucosal plexus inside the submucosal. And the enteric plexus found between two layers of muscularis. Easy peasy. That is the myenteric. All right. And then over here, I just sort of, again, I'll change the color because the cyan isn't working for me on this particular color scheme. So let me just change the color and come up with, let's say, you know what? I'll do black. Why not black? Just for something different. Okay. So here's a loop right here where you could come up, and here's one loop entirely within the ENS, and then right back down. Right. Where's a second loop? Second loop could run up on this afferent sensory to this interneuron entirely within the ENS, and then running down again to get mucosal epithelia to glandular epithelium to secrete. Or it could run in such a way that it is moving here to get muscular action, smooth muscular action. Okay, and these loops that I just drew in black are ENS loops, entirely sensing, integrating, and responding entirely within the gut brain with zero CNS activity or input whatsoever. All right, hopefully that helped, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.